Cool, so here we are where we last left off. If I do a quick render, we'll see that I've got my cans and they're kind of in this nice little studio environment. While we were working last class, I did a little bit of work to add more detail to my texture. I have sort of like the nutritional facts and like a little barcode, and I updated the actual logo itself, added the little tagline, which is "It's highly addictive." So I think I'm about ready to turn this in, except for there's one last kind of cool bit that I would like to cover, and that is depth of field. And so if you aren't familiar with what that term means, let's just pull up something on Google Images. So depth of field is the result of objects either closer or further in the camera being out of focus or in focus. So in this photo of this rock, or this little beach, whatever, this little stack of rocks is in focus, and the rocks that are at the bottom of this photo, which is closer to us, the camera, are blurry, and the background is also blurry. So there are lots and lots of examples of what this looks like online, and most likely in some of your reference images even, there are visible amounts of depth of field. In my example, there isn't a whole lot, but just for the purposes of the lecture, I will sort of tweak my scene just a little bit so that I can cover it. So to do that, I'm going to shuffle some of my cans around ever so slightly. So instead of the three cans being aligned to each other, this is kind of the stage. Us, the camera, we're down here, sort of looking at the cans. I'm going to move one a little bit back and one a little bit forward. And then we are going to observe depth of field. So it's a little tricky to set up, or I shouldn't say tricky. There are some steps involved, but for the most part, it's worth it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, if we are going to be including this, is to go to our render settings, and we want to change the renderer up here from standard to physical. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow the program and some of the settings within it to kind of think a little bit more realistically. And it's going to open up some different options for us on our camera. The most important part of that being the depth of field settings, so that we can kind of replicate the fact that some objects will be in focus and other objects will be out of focus. So in physical, on here on the left-hand side, I'm going to want to check on the effect for depth of field, just the little check mark there. And then in my camera, in this case, I'm going to name it camera depth of field, just so that I know. I'm going to want to jump to one of my cameras that I can see sort of above my scene. And we'll notice that there are these little orange handles which move these green and white lines. If I jump out of my camera, we'll see here's my little camera over here, and this kind of cone, this field of view, is showing where my camera's looking at. And on the end here, sort of where these orange handles leave us, this is going to be where we want to be in focus. This is essentially our focus point. So this isn't everything we need to do. There are a couple more settings that we want to enable, and that is on the Details tab of our camera. We want to enable or check on the depth of field front map and rear map. And in doing so, you'll see that some more, it'll be hard to see on the projector probably, but it's coming up on screen. There are some more sets of green lines that have accompanying little handles on them. And these are your, effectively, they're the start and end of your depth of field. So what you want to do is this one in the beginning here, this is the front map. You want to move this so that it is just before the first object in your scene. What I mean by that is, here I have my floor. This is where my floor is starting. I want to move the handle here for the front map to be close to the first object in my scene. In this case, it is the bottom of the floor. I don't want to put it up against the front can in my scene because this is going to wind up creating too much depth of field. So if I pull that back, and then I want to apply the same logic to the rear blur, and that is I want to move it so that it is just past my furthest away object. And my furthest away object in this case is my background, this little stage that we have. So if I kind of spin around to the back, we can see that this rear blur is just peeking out the back. So that's what I want. And so if we jump into our camera and we click render, it might look crazy, it might not. No effect is visible yet. And that is because here it is most likely this f-stop number. Now if you are familiar with photography, you will have a little bit of a leg up on understanding what an f-stop and an aperture is. But know that the information you might have from real-world experience sort of doesn't translate to the program. And what I mean by that is I'm going to lower this value because the effect or the amount of depth of field is either not or very, very little amount visible. So I'm going to try a value of 1 because hopefully that should lower my aperture, in which case will create more depth of field. Hopefully, if I haven't forgotten one of the settings. So let's try 0.1. Here we go. So a very, very small value. This is an unrealistically small value, by the way, but 0.1. We're starting to see that we have a visual effect in that the can here on the right is blurry, the can here on the left is blurry, and the can here in the middle, which is where we aimed our focus at, is, well, it's sharp, it's clear, it's in focus. So if I make this a comically small number, like 0.01, we will get a very pronounced, almost tilt shift-like effect, where we may appear to be an ant or some sort of very, very, very tiny observer. So this is a little wild. I think most people would agree that this is probably too much blur. It is kind of a masterpiece, I won't lie. But yeah, this is a little bit too strong. Now this value, what you wind up with is going to be kind of scene dependent. What I mean by that is everyone's probably going to have a different value that works for them. Just because, you know, the way that we brought in our reference image and kind of traced the shape of our can, you know, some people might have had a really large image and that would result in them tracing out a very large can. Some people might have had a smaller reference image, so their can might be smaller. You know, each person's objects in scene is going to kind of be in a different scale. So enable all those settings, which again, just as a little refresher, is you want to change the renderer to physical, and then here on the physical tab on the left, you want to check on depth of field, and then in your camera settings, go to details, enable your depth of field front and rear blur, position them accordingly, and then in the physical tab of the camera, we want to adjust this f-stop value. And lower, in most cases, well, all cases, lower will mean more blur, higher will mean less blur. but you will have to find the number that works best for you. So I'm going to try a value of like maybe 0.1, and just for the heck of it, I'm going to put the brick material on my backdrop, even though I'm pretty sure it's going to look awful. Just so that I want to illustrate what effect this is going to have on my ground as well. It was hard to tell on the all-white material because, well, it's all white, so it's hard to tell what is or isn't in focus. Here it's a lot more apparent that the background, which is now sort of looking like an awful set of bricks, is out of focus. And if you were to render this out and zoom in, you'd kind of be able to identify sort of where on the ground the focus point is. But I don't want this brick. I'm just going to delete that out. And I think I'm good. I'm going to raise this value up a little bit more just because 0.1 is too much for my taste. So I'm going to try like a 0.4 maybe. I just want kind of a hint of the effect. And so now I want to prepare my file for final rendering. And to do that, I'm going to have to edit some of my render settings because we have quite a bit of grain here on the ground. And on the label, the little barcode, we see like a lot of kind of speckles, which are not desired. So here in my render settings, I'm going to want to jump to the physical tab again. And I'm going to try to set my sampler, which is this one right here, to adaptive, and the quality to automatic. I think of this as a more simple workflow because this is going to remove a lot of the hassle or potential room for error, because it leaves us with just one single value right here, which is this shading error threshold value. So if I slide this out of the way and we render this, we'll see that there is quite a bit of grain, and that is because we are at a value of 20%, which is basically we're letting the math sort of calculate with a margin of error of about 20%. So if I lower this to, say, 5 or 10, and I'm going to do a region render just because I know that the lower you go, the longer it's going to take, because the kind of more stringent, the more harshly it's calculating, which means it's going to take longer, but it'll result in a more accurate, less grainy, less noisy image. So this value of 0.5 isn't too bad. I know that there is still a little bit of grain here, so I'm going to try a value of like maybe 3. This is going to be relatively dependent on the materials in your scene. This is, again, one of those buttons or settings that is going to be very much different depending on your scene. But that's looking pretty good. That is pretty dang clean. And I can always use sort of like a denoising filter or some sort of other Photoshop adjustment layer to sort of clean up some of this further. So I think I'm cool with that. So basically, if you are using the physical renderer and you set the sampler and sampler quality to adaptive and automatic, you really just want to play with this value. Lower means cleaner, which will take more time. So use that information to your advantage. Determine what quality level you would like. Obviously, because we are trying to make one really beautiful, awesome, super sweet photograph, we don't want to have a lot of junky noise or grain. So I'm going to expect that you do a little bit of effort here and don't just leave it at the default value, which is most likely going to result in a unsatisfactory image. But I think that's going to be it as far as the settings go. We don't have anything animating, so motion blur is not a priority for us. So I think I'm ready to set up the rest of my render settings and actually output this. And again, we're only outputting one frame, so we can set the frame range to current frame, which will most likely just be frame 0. Most people probably haven't even clicked the play button in their scenes, which is fine. And again, our resolution is going to be pretty big for this assignment. So in my case, because I want a horizontal image, I'm going to do 2500 by 1600. But you could go for a vertical aspect ratio, which would mean 1600 by 2500. That'll result in sort of a portrait kind of photo. And then in save, I just want to check on the save button and set up my file so that it renders. So I'm going to enter in my renders folder. In my case, I do not need an alpha channel because I've got a full background. If you want to replace your background in After Effects or Photoshop, whatever, maybe using some techniques that we covered in the last assignment, feel free to do that. In that case, you would want to render with an alpha channel checked on. But other than that, I think we're good. So I'm going to save my project as a version 4. And then I'm going to click the Render to Picture Viewer button. So this is going to start calculating, and we can see just how large this is in comparison to previous stuff we've rendered, and thusly how slow it will go. So this is going to take a little while. I will not subject everyone in this lecture, or recording I should say, to sitting through this, so I'm going to pause the video and then we will come back once this is finished. Alright, so we're going to pick back up on the lecture because my render just finished, and we can see in the bottom left hand corner down here it took 23 minutes and 24 seconds, which is a little while for one frame. So your experience will vary. Yours might be quicker, it might be longer. One thing that did sort of help me out is the fact, or I should say, one thing that made my scene go a little bit quicker is the fact that so much of this background is a fairly generic white. It doesn't have to calculate too much. The areas that took the longest were down here on the floor where the can is reflecting against the ground. So just kind of keep that in mind, you know, and it's not related, or it won't like kind of impact your grade if your render goes super quick, and it also doesn't make you cool if it goes super slow and you're like, oh, my render took 7 hours, look how sweet I am. Well, if that's the case, there's probably something that you could have done to make it not take 7 hours. That's what I'm gonna say. So let's check this out in Photoshop and finish this bad boy up. Should have opened this ahead of time. Alright, here we are. So let's go find that. So in my assignment 3 renders, I have a single image in here. So let's open this up and check it out at full size. Oops. So it's very large, a lot larger than the resolution of this monitor, and so viewing this entire image at one time will prove challenging. But as we zoom in here, we can clearly see the difference between the middle can here on the right, which is in focus, and the further away can, which is out of focus, which is pretty cool. And for the most part, this image is very clean in terms of the noise or grain. My settings were set up pretty good. There's just a little bit of a hint here on the ground and here on the label that gave me a little bit of trouble, but you know, nothing will be perfect. And actually to a small degree, this can help make a render look a little bit more realistic. So let's just finish this up. We can try to do a little bit of color correction to this. Photoshop's freaking out. To my layer. So I'm going to call this can render. We can try the old standby of a curves adjustment. And what a curves adjustment can do is it's going to alter the intensity of, well, kind of the brightness and darkness of the render at certain points throughout it. So here on the levels, I'll just do like kind of a quick breakdown. On the upper right here we have the bright portions of the image, so if I pull this down, we'll see that everything's going to turn black. And here on the bottom left, this represents the dark portions of the image. If I pull this up, we'll see everything turns white. So that just kind of gets that out of the way. A common thing to do is called an S-curve, and this will darken the darks and brighten the brights. And to do that, we can click one in the middle just to kind of keep it in place, and then make one down here on the lower sort of intersection and pull that down just a smidge, and then kind of do the same thing in reverse up here, make one kind of along this intersection and raise this up. Now because my image has so much white in it, this is actually probably not the move, because this is sort of making the fact that these whites are so blown out, it's kind of making it a little bit worse. But it kind of helps the contrast and kind of the pop of the color. So I don't know, maybe I'll keep it. But my favorite tool in here, or in Photoshop I should say, if I make this layer a smart object real quick, my favorite effect is the camera raw filter. And this is pretty sweet because it allows us a lot of controls all at once. So we've got curves, sharpening, color adjustments, more color adjustments, even more color adjustments, also film grain and vignetting, and then finally even more color adjustments. And the cool thing is if you use this at home a lot, you can save out a preset, and when I'm at home I've got a list of like 100, so I can just click through and I can see every crazy wild color correction I've ever done, and it kind of gives me a starting point when I make a new render. You know, I can kind of browse different sort of moods or different looks. So what I usually like to do is at the start here, I usually try to click the auto on the exposure settings and stuff, and this kind of just gives a little bit of a starting point. So this window here is showing the current amount of settings. There is this button right here is the second from the left. It is the swap before/after settings. The hotkey is P. So this is kind of like a before and after. So I usually like to jump between my before and after a lot. And so because this is an advertisement and I kind of want to showcase how cool and awesome this product is, I kind of want to make the colors pop a little bit more and just overall make this look a little bit more kind of attractive as a product, not just so kind of clean and sort of dull and boring. So a little bit of noise reduction will help me out on the floor. So if I click to zoom in to 100%, we'll see that as I raise up this noise reduction value, it kind of smooths out the ground a bit. So if I hit P, to jump between my before and after settings. Hopefully this is coming up on the recording. If not, take my word for it. And so if I jump over to my colors, I'm going to pull the blue, the saturation of the blue down just a little bit, just because it's kind of a little too crazy. I'm going to do the same thing with the magentas, or nope, maybe the purples, just to kind of tone down how hot pink this logo is. And what I like about this is it allows us to kind of slide the colors a little bit. So let's just say, for whatever reason, if the client came back to me and they said, let's make the pink here in the text a little bit more red. You know, let's just say like they sent me over the wrong kind of color, the wrong like color swatch or whatever. Instead of having to re-render fully, I could use a hue and saturation effect to maybe alter the color of the text here on this pink. So I kind of like the way that looks, making it a little bit warmer. So I'm just going to kind of go quickly through the rest of these. So another popular sort of color correction technique is I forget the actual name for it, but if I look up cyan and orange movie poster, it's kind of a well-known effect that the colors orange and sort of a bluish or a cyan are very, very popular in film grading. Almost every big movie that comes out, particularly notable offenders are the Transformers and some of the Marvel films. Wonder Woman kind of did it well, but that was maybe a little bit more drab. So yeah, the color pairing of sort of a sort of warmish color on the bright portions of your render and a bluish color in the darker portions of your image can kind of affect the mood of what this looks like. And I don't want to spend too much more time on this because I don't think this will apply to everyone. But because of how sort of overpowering this background white is, I know that I want to do a little bit of dehazing, and I'm going to add just a hair of a vignette. And what a vignette is, if I kind of overpower this, it sort of darkens the corners of the image. I'm sure if you took or went through the Photoshop, intro to Photoshop class, I'm sure we've run into what a vignette is. I know Brian loves to scream about how overused they are, and I kind of agree. Although this sort of looks kind of cool, makes this look moody and almost kind of like the last Batman vs Superman film, where we have this like very dark, kind of depressing metal, kind of bluish gray tone. This is too much. But just a little bit kind of go a long way in sort of directing your eye back to sort of the center of the image. So if I kind of just adjust the roundness, I didn't really like the shape that this was making here, and not necessarily right there. So if I adjust this roundness setting here, it's going to be a little bit more sort of vertical in that it's not just only on the corners. So if I jump back to my before settings, this is this kind of bright, overpowering white. It's kind of, it's all right, but we can always kind of improve it. And this has got a little bit more kind of thought or effort put into it. I still think this blue is a little bit much, so I'm going to pull that down some more. And when I pull the saturation down, it's almost turning kind of into like a lavender, sort of very light purple. So if I go to the luminance here, I'm going to pull the darkness value of the blues down just to sort of help retain kind of the value of this color, not necessarily the hue. And I'm just going to hit OK. And we'll apply that. It's kind of like a do-it-yourself Instagram filter, if you are familiar and or love those. Additionally, if you want to browse through some presets of that, if I open up After Effects, and I'll just do this in the background while I save out this image. So I want to save my Photoshop file. So I want to save out myself a PSD so that I can always go back and edit this or resave it if I need to. And then I'm going to save out a JPEG or a PNG, and that's going to be what I'm going to turn in. So we'll save as a PNG. Okay. And if you are doing some sort of product, sort of advertisement, you can feel free to add maybe a slogan or some sort of a catch line, or something else in Photoshop. For example, I could always add in a tagline presented by so and so, or you could put your name on it, do whatever. Those are always options for you.
So do we have to add a backdrop?
You don't have to. I would, if your render has like a purely colored background, like maybe pure black or pure white, I would potentially look for a reference that has a little bit kind of more life to it, a little bit more kind of visual interest. But if it fits with your product, if that is what the bulk of your product imagery looks like, for example, if you're recreating a brand of something and they really only do display their product on a black background, well then maybe you can make that argument to me of, hey, this company does only show their products on black or on a white background. So I'm open to that kind of counter argument. But yeah, let me just turn this in, and so I want to grab my PNG, and we'll go to assignment 3 turn-in. Yeah, cool. So here is the assignment 3 turn-in folder, and you'll just paste in your single image. Not too difficult there. So yeah, that'll be that. But real quick, I just want to show, if you're into kind of the color correction sort of thing, or if you really love applying filters on Instagram, there is a pretty cool tool in After Effects that we have access to, and I just want to show that real quick. So in After Effects, I'm going to pull in my uncolor corrected, or my original image, and make a composition out of it, and zoom in. And the effect that I want to apply, if it loads, or maybe fast forward the video. Oh, here we go. Cool. So if I type in looks, L-O-O-K-S, there is a effect under Magic Bullet looks, and if I drag that down onto my render, it will hopefully open up this. So I can, here on the left hand side on my effects controls, I can click edit, and if I haven't been lying, there should be a bunch of presets that we can browse through. It's been a while since I've used this. Yeah, so if we mouse over the bottom left over here, it's called looks, and there are a lot of presets to look through. I made a pun and didn't even realize it. So there is Blockbuster Warm and Blockbuster Cool. So yeah, this is kind of referencing back to some of that movie poster stuff that I was talking about. So you can browse through all these different kind of effects, maybe make it look vintage or something wild, if you would so like. And once you're done, you can explore what some of these different settings are on the tools here. Over on the right, you can browse through more effects to add. So I'm not going to go through all of this. If you would really like to learn more, you can ask me for help. This is probably my second favorite part of motion graphics. So then you will check the little check mark to apply that effect, and if I hit the little stopwatch and then turn that off and then hit tilde, we can maybe zoom in and kind of get a before and after on what this looks like. So if you're into that, cool. If you're not, well then I'm sorry. The last cool thing that we can add potentially is a lens flare, because everybody loves lens flares. And we can type in optical flare, hopefully. Nope, maybe not. Nope, I lied. We don't have the lens flare plugin. That's fine. Yeah, I think that'll conclude this. Yeah. Oh, here we go. If you really want to add a lens flare, you can look for this plugin called Null Light Factory. And I haven't used this one before, so have fun playing around with these settings, and you can make a super awesome lens flare if you so desire. Yeah.